U.S. President Joe Biden has made a rare Oval Office address appealing to Americans to support Israel and Ukraine in their wars.
Mr. Biden said he would send a multi-billion-dollar aid package to Congress later today to support critical allies. He addressed the sentiment that both conflicts were distant to many Americans, arguing that U.S. backing was necessary as the survival of Israel and Ukraine was vital also to America's security.
The president compared Hamas to Russian leader Vladimir Putin. He said both represent different threats, but share the common desire of wanting to annihilate a neighboring democracy. It's unclear whether Congress can quickly approve the supplemental budget, as the lower house of representatives is currently embroiled in a tussle over the next speaker. Now, for more on the takeaways from President Biden's address, let's speak with Michael Singh. He's Managing Director and Lane Swig Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Michael, thank you for your time today. Let's start with President Biden. He made the case that the cost of inaction and the cost of walking away from these conflicts is much higher than not. Help us understand that better.
Well, yeah, the United States has been in a period here where, the question of aid to Ukraine, the question of American engagement overseas has been increasingly controversial, and it's faced increasing opposition in Congress and even amongst American voters. And so I think what you heard from President Biden was an effort to sort of talk about the big picture. He said, we're at an inflection point in history. And he said, American leadership is the glue that holds the world together, really trying to make the big picture strategic case and then drill down into the specific requests that he was going to be making to Congress. More aid for Ukraine, which is actually the lion's share of the $100 billion package that he's going to be sending up. More aid for Israel, which is something that will be very popular with Congress and with the American people, and frankly will help get the aid to Ukraine through in their package together. And so it was sort of this pitch for continuing American leadership and engagement overseas and a willingness to bear the costs that go with that.
Michael, the president making this primetime address directly to the people in the U.S., our correspondent earlier called it a sales pitch. I want to know, do you think Americans bought it? How much did the messaging register domestically when some argue Biden should be focusing on problems closer to home?
Well, this is, it's a constant theme in American politics that, let's invest in America. Let's, focus on problems close to home. And I think that American presidents often find themselves having to make the case as to why protecting ourselves at home and why ensuring prosperity in the United States requires this leadership overseas. And I think that was sort of an element of what President Biden was trying to say. And I think that the reason that he ties it to what's happening with Israel and with the war in Gaza is that that's something that has the attention of Americans. Americans care about Israel. They have tended to care a lot about terrorism. And I think this is an opportunity to say, here is why America's role overseas is so important, because these problems won't go away by themselves. He made this point very clearly, that if you don't sort of confront Hamas, the terrorists, if you don't confront Vladimir Putin, the kind of big power aggressor who wants to gobble up his neighbors, they won't stop there. They'll keep going, and eventually these problems will get bigger, and addressing them will be costlier.
Now, you mentioned the support that Israel has both from Congress and America more broadly, and that he's attempting to try and tie this together with Ukraine and Russia. Why is there sort of less enthusiasm when it comes to the continued support for Ukraine's efforts against Russia?
I think it's a very complex mix of factors. Some of it is just partisan politics, frankly. It's President Biden, who's a Democrat, asking for the money, and so that'll, get maybe some reflexive opposition from Republicans. But I think it also has to do with, if you look at the sort of rank order of America's threat perceptions, Americans always put terrorism, frankly, at the top of their list of threats that they worry about. And then other threats like Russia or even like China, which has been rising actually in terms of the list of threats Americans worry about. You have to make a little bit more of a case as to why Americans should feel threatened by these things half a world away from them, about why the United States should care about a war that's taking place in the east of Europe. It requires more of a persuasive case, whereas getting Americans to care about Israel, getting Americans to care about terrorism is very easy. And so I think it's natural that the president would want to say, hey, these are actually all part of the same fight, that if you care about this one thing over here, terrorism, you should also care about what happens in Europe. And you should also care, for that matter, about what happens in Asia. And that's, I think, the case he tried to make. It's a tough case to make, but I think it's an important case to make, because that essentially is at the core of the case for American leadership and engagement overseas.
So the president arguing engagement is crucial because it's a matter of national security, but polls are showing, support around arming Ukraine, for instance, has dropped. How is Biden going to sustain his campaign? Is fatigue going to set in among the public?
Well, I think one thing that's important is that Congress approve a significant amount of aid for Ukraine that can last for a while, because part of the problem is when you continually bring the same question up before Americans. I think part of the reason you see fatigue is they'll say, well, didn't we just do this? Didn't we just fund this? And why are we doing it again? And so I think that the president, it is important that he bring forward a significantly sized aid package so that it will sort of address Ukraine's needs for some time. And that's important for the Ukrainians as well, to understand that they have what they need in the pipeline, for a longer period of time. It'll help them to plan. But frankly, again, Americans, I think, have just a natural skepticism about sort of indefinite engagements overseas. And that's also impacted, of course, by our experience in Iraq, Afghanistan, and some other places in recent decades. And some of that skepticism, some of that fatigue is justified. And that's why I think it's really sort of the burden has to be on American political leaders, and hopefully we'll see it from both parties, to make the case to Americans as to why we need to do this again, why this is important, not just, for some abstract reason or for some other country, but it's actually important to their own security and prosperity as well.
And for Biden to push through the funding that he's asking for, he's going to need a functioning House of Representatives, which has been anything but functioning in the last few weeks or so. Tell us how you think that, or the lack of a speaker at the moment, is going to impact that. And do you think this will add some urgency for Republicans to get their act together?
Well, I think it has already added some urgency. That doesn't mean that the task is any easier, frankly. The president bringing an aid package for Israel forward, I think, is going to hopefully serve as an impetus for the House to get a speaker elected, or in the absence of that, failing that, to give the powers to the temporary speaker, to this man, Patrick McHenry, who's presiding, a picture of him right there, over at the House at the moment, to get this kind of bill through. I'm not an expert in legislative procedure, but my hope is that, yes, this will be a little bit of a fillip for Congress to start moving forward.
We're running out of time, but I want to talk about the U.S. election that is on the horizon. How has Biden's declarations, his handling of the Israel-Hamas war, impacted dynamics within the Democrat camp? Some arguing he's driving progressive voters, young Muslims away.
Well, look, I think it's too soon to tell how this will affect the elections next year. There's a long way to go until November of 2024, when the elections take place. And I think so much will depend on the outcome. So much will depend on whether American support to Israel is judged to have produced success, whether the U.S. can really hold its nerve, and whether President Biden comes out of this looking like someone who has led the United States and led the world through a difficult crisis. Obviously, we already see debate about it on the Republican side. It's already had reverberations in the Republican primary, because there are some candidates in the Republican primary who, frankly, would step away from this kind of leadership or this kind of assistance to partners and so forth. And I think that that's where we've seen the more immediate impact. But I think for President Biden, it will all come down to whether his involvement in this conflict is judged a success by Americans. But look, most Americans, I think, are very much behind the type of policy that President Biden outlined, the policy of having the back of our partner Israel, as well as having the back of democracies everywhere against aggression, whether it's from terrorism or whether it's from a tyrant.
Really appreciate your insight today. Thank you. Michael Singh, Managing Director, and Lane Swig, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.